Welcome to Silent Fears, where every grave tells its own nightmare. Here, we reveal chilling true encounters with the restless dead. Stories that will haunt you long after the video ends. If you crave real supernatural mysteries, subscribe and hit the bell for more. Are you brave enough to discover what the darkness is truly hiding? Join Silent Fears and step beyond the veil tonight. Let's move to our first haunting tale. And this one begins with a groundskeeper who found his own name carved into a headstone that had been weathered for over a century. My name is David, and I have worked as a cemetery groundskeeper for 12 years. There is one rule they never put in the manual. Never under any circumstances enter Section 9 alone after 1 a.m. The veteran workers who trained me made this crystal clear on my first day at Magnolia Grove Cemetery in Georgia, but they never explained why. They would just shake their heads and whisper something about respecting the old agreements with those who came before us. I wish I had listened more carefully to their warnings, instead of dismissing them as folklore for men who had spent too many years walking among the dead. What happened to me 4 months ago has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about death, burial, and the fragile boundary that separates our world from whatever exists beyond. I'm sharing this story now because I can no longer bear the weight of it alone, and because someone needs to warn others about what dwells in the shadows of our most sacred grounds. Magnolia Grove Cemetery has been under my care since 2016. A sprawling 50-acre burial ground that dates back to 1852. The cemetery is divided into 10 sections, each representing different periods of burials and social standings. Section 9 is the most ancient, where the wealthy plantation owners and Confederate officers of the 1850s were laid to rest in elaborate marble mausoleums and towering monuments that cast long shadows over the newer, modest graves. The section sits on elevated ground overlooking the Savannah River, separated from the main cemetery by a grove of massive live oak trees draped in Spanish moss that seems to move even when there's no wind. The incident happened on a Wednesday night in early November. A severe thunderstorm had swept through Georgia the day before, leaving the cemetery scattered with broken branches, toppled flower arrangements, and several damaged headstones that required immediate repair. The cemetery board had scheduled a large memorial service for Friday afternoon, which meant I had less than 48 hours to restore the grounds to acceptable condition. Working during regular hours alone would not provide sufficient time, so I made the decision that would alter my life forever. I would work through the night. I arrived at the cemetery at 8:30 p.m., parking my maintenance vehicle near the main gate and loading my cart with tools, flashlights, and portable work lights. The November air was cool and still, carrying the rich scent of damp earth and decomposing leaves. Most of the storm damage was concentrated in sections 4 through 7, but several large oak branches had fallen across the pathways leading to Section 9. I decided to clear those first, thinking it would be a simple task that I could finish, before focusing on the more extensive repairs in other areas. The walk to Section 9 takes approximately 15 minutes from the main entrance, following a curved stone path that winds through the heart of the cemetery. During daylight hours, it's a serene journey past centuries of history, etched in marble and granite. At night, however, the familiar monuments take on an entirely different presence. The elaborate Confederate memorials cast shifting shadows in my lantern light, creating the impression of movement where none should exist. The ancient live oaks that surround Section 9 appeared larger and more threatening than usual, their moss-covered branches reaching across the path like skeletal arms trying to block my passage. I reached Section 9 at approximately 9:45 p.m. and immediately began clearing the fallen branches from the main walkway. The work was routine and calming, requiring nothing more than dragging debris to designated disposal areas and inspecting nearby monuments for damage. The battery-powered work lights provided sufficient illumination for the task, and I settled into a steady rhythm that made the hours pass quickly. By 11:45 p.m., I had cleared most of the walkway and was preparing to move to other sections when I heard something that made me freeze. It began as a soft whistling sound, barely perceptible above the gentle rustling of Spanish moss in the breeze. At first, I thought it might be wind moving through the old mausoleums, or perhaps night birds calling from the river below. But as I listened more intently, I realized the sound was coming from within Section 9 itself, somewhere among the elaborate tombs and monuments that dotted the hillside. The whistling had a melodic quality to it, like someone softly humming an old spiritual or hymn in a dialect I couldn't recognize. I picked up my strongest flashlight and followed the sound deeper into Section 9, past rows of weathered monuments surrounded by elaborate wrought iron gates that had rusted with age. The whistling grew clearer as I approached the section's most historic area, where the most influential families of antebellum Georgia had constructed their eternal monuments. The sound seemed to originate from a massive granite tomb belonging to the Beauregard family, wealthy cotton plantation owners who had controlled vast portions of the region during the mid-1800s. The Beauregard Monument was one of the most impressive structures in the entire cemetery, featuring carved Confederate eagles, intricate stonework, and heavy iron doors that had been sealed for over a century and a half. I had maintained the surrounding area for 12 years without any unusual incidents, but I had never heard any sounds coming from within the structure itself. As I approached the monument, the whistling stopped immediately, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to echo in my ears. I stood motionless for several minutes, listening for any continuation of the sound and scanning the area with my flashlight for any logical explanation. The beam revealed nothing abnormal, just the familiar headstones and monuments I had tended hundreds of times before. I was preparing to return to my work when I noticed something that made my heart skip. The iron doors of the Beauregard Monument, which had been locked and sealed for decades, were standing partially open. The gap between the doors was maybe 8 inches, but it was definitely open. I approached slowly, my flashlight beams shaking slightly in my unsteady grip. The metal doors were extremely heavy and corroded, requiring considerable force to move them even when they were unlocked. There was no way they could have opened naturally, and no living person had access to the keys except for the cemetery board members and myself. I reached the doors and peered through the narrow opening into the blackness beyond. My flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet into the monument's interior, revealing stone walls lined with burial chambers and stagnant air thick with the smell of decay and something else I couldn't identify. Something floral and sickening that reminded me of funeral wreaths left too long in stagnant water. That's when I heard the voice. David. The word drifted out from the darkness inside the monument, spoken in a man's voice that carried a thick southern accent from a bygone era. It wasn't a whisper or a shout, but something in between that seemed to bypass my ears completely and resonate directly inside my skull. The voice knew my name, which was impossible since I had never encountered anyone in the cemetery after hours, and the dead had no way of learning the names of those who maintained their graves. David, step inside. We have been observing you. The voice spoke again, and this time I could detect multiple tones beneath the words, as if several people were speaking in perfect harmony. The sound was hypnotic and terrifying simultaneously, like a choir of Confederate soldiers singing a song of the lost cause. Every survival instinct I possessed urged me to run, to flee Section 9 and never return. But something more powerful than fear held me in place, drawn to the darkness beyond those iron doors, like a ship drawn to a lighthouse. I pushed the door open wider and stepped across the threshold into the Beauregard Monument. The air inside was thick and motionless, carrying that same floral, rotting scent, but amplified 100-fold. My flashlight beam revealed a rectangular chamber lined with marble burial chambers, each sealed with a stone panel bearing the name and dates of the deceased. The floor was covered with decades of dust and debris, disturbed by footprints that were definitely not mine. Welcome, David. We have watched you care for our resting place for so many years. Such devotion, such respect. The voices seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, echoing off the stone walls but also originating from inside my own mind. I turned slowly, sweeping my flashlight across the burial chambers, searching for the source of the sound. That's when I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows between the burial chambers, translucent forms that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. There were at least 10 of them. Men dressed in Confederate uniforms and formal wear from different historical periods, Civil War gray uniforms and cavalry sabers, antebellum suits and plantation coats, Victorian morning dress and elaborate military decorations. They moved with liquid grace, floating rather than walking, their boots never quite touching the dusty floor. At the center of the group stood a man in an elaborate Confederate colonel's uniform, his pale face framed by a carefully groomed beard in the style popular during the 1850s. His eyes were the color of old pewter, and when he smiled, I could see that his teeth were stained dark with what appeared to be old tobacco and something else. "I am Colonel Beauregard," he said, his voice no longer coming from multiple sources, but clearly emanating from his own lips. "This is my family's monument, though, as you can observe, we do not truly rest. We wait. We watch. We remember those who show proper reverence to the fallen." The other figures began to move closer, forming a circle around me that grew tighter with each passing moment. I tried to step back toward the door, but found my legs would not respond to my commands. It was as if the stone floor had become quicksand, holding me in place while these impossible beings closed in from all directions. "You have been faithful, David," Beauregard continued, his dark-stained smile growing broader. 12 years of dedicated service, maintaining our eternal monuments with such care and attention. But there is additional work to be done, work that can only be accomplished by someone who understands the true meaning of honor. One of the other figures, dressed in a cavalry uniform from the 1860s, stepped forward and extended his hand toward me. His skin was gray and leathery, covered with what looked like soil and dried Spanish moss. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of distant cannon fire and battle cries. "The living have forgotten us," he said. "They walk among our graves with disrespect, taking selfies and making jokes about our sacrifice. Children run across our burial plots. College students gather at night to drink and vandalize. They must be taught proper honor." The circle of figures continued to tighten around me, and I could feel cold radiating from their forms, like winter air seeping through cracked stone. My flashlight began to dim, its beam growing weaker with each passing second. until I was surrounded by nothing but shadows and glowing eyes. "You will help us teach them," Beauregard said, reaching out to touch my shoulder with fingers that felt like ice-cold marble. "You will be our voice among the living, our guardian, our enforcer of proper respect." The moment his fingers made contact with my skin, images flooded my consciousness. I saw the cemetery as it had been generations ago, filled with mourners dressed in black who spoke in reverent whispers and left fresh magnolias on every grave. I saw families gathering for memorial services, children learning proper behavior among the dead, and a community that understood death as a sacred transition rather than something to be feared or mocked. Then the images shifted, showing me the cemetery as it had become in recent years. Teenagers spray-painting graffiti on historic monuments, wedding photographers posing couples against mausoleums for Instagram photos, paranormal investigators treating the grounds like an amusement park, and tour groups trampling across burial plots while guides told sensationalized ghost stories for entertainment. "This is why we cannot rest," Beauregard whispered, his voice now inside my head rather than in my ears. "This is why we must intervene. The living have lost all respect for the dead, and it is time they learned the consequences." The cold from his touch spread through my body like winter fog, numbing my limbs and clouding my thoughts. I tried to speak, to protest, to explain that I was just a groundskeeper with no authority over visitors or cemetery policies, but no words would form. Instead, I felt something else taking control of my voice. Something ancient and proud that had been waiting for this opportunity for generations. "I understand," I heard myself saying, though the words felt foreign in my mouth. "I will help you restore proper respect to this sacred ground. I will be your guardian among the living." The figures began to fade back into the shadows, their forms becoming more translucent before disappearing entirely. Only Beauregard remained, his pewter gray eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my soul feel exposed and vulnerable. "Every night after 1 a.m., he said, his voice becoming fainter as his form dissolved. "Section 9. We will tell you what must be done." I found myself standing alone in the empty monument, my flashlight flickering back to full power as if nothing had occurred. The iron doors stood wide open behind me, revealing the familiar cemetery grounds bathed in silver moonlight. I stumbled out of the monument and back down the path, my mind reeling from what I had experienced. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and too many hours among the graves. But that evening, I found myself returning to Section 9 at exactly 1 a.m., drawn by a compulsion I could not resist. The figures were waiting for me, and they began to explain my new responsibilities as guardian of their eternal honor. That was 4 months ago. Since then, I have learned things about death and the afterlife that no living person should know. I have become something more and less than human, walking the line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. I am telling this story as a warning to anyone who visits cemeteries, especially historic, especially burial grounds where the dead have had centuries to grow restless. Show proper respect. Remove your hat. Speak in whispers. Never step directly on a grave. Leave flowers if you feel moved to do so, but take nothing away. And above all, remember that death is not the end of consciousness, merely a transformation of its nature. The dead are watching. They remember everything. And some of them, like those who rest in Section 9 of Magnolia Grove Cemetery, are no longer content to remain silent observers of the living world. I still work as a groundskeeper, but my duties now extend far beyond maintaining lawns and clearing debris. I am the guardian of the dead, the enforcer of their will among the living. And every night at 1 a.m., I return to Section 9 to receive my instructions from those who refuse to rest in dishonor. Let's move to our second story. And the tale starts with a digital artist who discovered that some cemetery monuments change their appearance only in photographs. Digital art was supposed to be my escape from corporate stress. But that night at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago changed everything I thought I knew about capturing images of the dead. My name is Robert, and I've been a graphic designer for 9 years, specializing in digital photography and architectural documentation. What started as a peaceful artistic project became my worst nightmare when I discovered that some subjects alter themselves between the moment you press the shutter and the moment the image appears on your screen. The incident occurred on October 31st, 2024. During one of Chicago's most brutal autumn storms. The city was being hammered by freezing rain and 60-mile-per-hour winds, and temperatures had dropped from 70 degrees to 35 degrees in just 6 hours. Most photographers would consider such conditions impossible for outdoor work. But I had always been drawn to dramatic weather photography, particularly how storms transform familiar landmarks into something otherworldly and menacing. Graceland Cemetery had been on my photography list for months. The 119-acre Victorian Cemetery is home to some of Chicago's most elaborate monuments and mausoleums, featuring Gothic revival architecture that becomes even more dramatic when illuminated by lightning and covered in rain. I had visited during daylight hours several times to scout locations, but had never attempted storm photography there due to the cemetery's reputation and my own reasonable fear of working alone in such a vast, isolated space during severe weather. That Halloween evening, however, circumstances aligned in a way that seemed like destiny calling. My art director had rejected my latest commercial project earlier that week, leaving me emotionally drained and desperate for a creative outlet to prove my artistic worth. The weather forecast predicted the storm would peak around midnight, creating perfect conditions for the kind of dramatic cemetery photography that had been haunting my imagination for months. Most importantly, I was frustrated enough with my career to ignore my usual caution about venturing into places where the living were not welcome after dark. I packed my equipment carefully, knowing that rain and electrical storms could destroy thousands of dollars of camera gear in seconds. 2 weatherproof Canon cameras with different lenses, extra batteries in waterproof cases, a carbon fiber tripod rated for extreme weather conditions, and several high-powered LED panels sealed against moisture. I also brought rain gear, waterproof camera covers, and enough protective clothing to survive several hours in the brutal storm. The cemetery gates are locked after sunset, but I had researched alternative entry points during my daytime visits. A maintenance gate along Clark Street had a broken lock that had not been repaired for weeks, creating access for someone determined enough to brave both the weather and the legal consequences. I parked my car in a 24-hour garage 8 blocks away and walked to the cemetery, carrying my equipment in a large waterproof backpack designed for extreme weather photography. Entering the cemetery illegally at 11:45 p.m. should have felt more dangerous or thrilling. But the storm had numbed both my emotions and my common sense. The rain was so intense that each step required careful attention to avoid slipping on wet pavement, and lightning strikes were illuminating the cemetery every few seconds with brilliant white flashes that revealed familiar landmarks transformed into alien shapes by rain and wind. I made my way toward the cemetery's oldest section, where the most photogenic monuments were located. The Victorian-era mausoleums and elaborate headstones created dramatic silhouettes against the storm-filled sky, and the lightning provided natural illumination that would enhance my long exposure shots. The rain was so heavy that I could only work for 5 or 10 minutes at a time before retreating to the shelter of a mausoleum to protect my equipment and prevent electrocution. My first series of photographs focused on a particularly striking monument belonging to the Hartwell family, wealthy railroad executives who had dominated Chicago's transportation industry during the late 1800s. The structure was built from white marble with intricate carved angels and decorative scrollwork, and the rain was creating natural water effects that would add drama to my storm photography. I set up my tripod and began taking long exposure shots, experimenting with different angles and lighting techniques to capture the monument's Gothic beauty enhanced by the violent weather. The extreme conditions made every camera adjustment painful as the rain penetrated even my waterproof gloves, and lightning strikes were close enough to make my equipment emit small electrical hums. But the images appearing on my camera's LCD screen were spectacular, better than anything I had captured in my professional career. After completing the monument shots, I moved deeper into the cemetery toward a section containing some of Chicago's most elaborate Victorian memorials. I was setting up my tripod near a towering obelisk when I first noticed something unusual in my camera's viewfinder. While composing the shot, I could see the obelisk clearly illuminated by a lightning flash, its granite surface polished smooth. But when I looked at the image after taking the photograph, there was something different in the frame that had not been visible during the actual lightning strike. The obelisk's carved inscription had changed. What I had seen with my naked eye was a simple family name and dates carved in elegant Victorian script. But in the digital image, the carved text was completely different. Names I had never seen before, dates that didn't match the monuments known, history and symbols that looked more like ancient hieroglyphs than Victorian memorial art. I assumed it was a digital artifact caused by the extreme weather conditions or perhaps electromagnetic interference from the lightning strikes. I took several more shots from different angles, but the altered inscription appeared in every photograph, always different from what I could see with my naked eye, and always changing between shots. In some images, the carved names were completely different families. In others, the dates changed to centuries that predated Chicago's founding. Most disturbing of all, in the final shot of the series, additional text had appeared that seemed to be addressing me directly. "Robert, we have been waiting for you to document our true stories." I lowered my camera and examined the obelisk directly, using my headlamp to read the actual carved inscription. It was exactly what I had seen originally, a simple family memorial with conventional Victorian text. There was no physical explanation for the alterations appearing in my photographs. The next series of photographs revealed even more disturbing anomalies. The headstone inscriptions were changing not just between shots, but within single photographs, as if the carved text was rewriting itself while my camera's shutter was open. In one image, a single headstone displayed multiple different names and dates layered over each other like double exposures. As I continued photographing, the alterations multiplied. Names of people who had died in Chicago's Great Fire appeared on monuments that predated the disaster. Dates from historical plague outbreaks appeared on graves from different decades. Most disturbing of all, some headstones began displaying names of living people I recognized. Colleagues from my design firm and family members who were very much alive. The most chilling realization came when I began to notice that the altered inscriptions were not random historical data. They were telling stories, connecting deaths across different time periods, revealing patterns of tragedy that spanned generations, and documenting disasters that had never been officially recorded in Chicago's history. By 2:30 a.m., I had captured over 150 photographs, and every single image contained altered text that was invisible to direct observation. The headstones were becoming like books, their surfaces filled with text that revealed Chicago's hidden history of death and loss. The storm had become unbearable, with lightning strikes close enough to create immediate thunder. My equipment was beginning to malfunction despite its weather protection. But more frightening than the physical discomfort was the growing certainty that the cemetery was communicating with me through my camera, using my digital photography to reveal truths that had been hidden for over a century. I began packing my equipment, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. As I disassembled my tripod, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices calling my name from different directions throughout the cemetery. Multiple voices, all saying, "Robert," with different accents that suggested speakers from different historical periods. I ran toward the cemetery exit, abandoning stealth in my desperation to escape. My boots slipped on the wet pavement, and I fell several times, but I did not stop running until I reached the broken gate. Only when I reached my car did I dare to look back at the cemetery. In the lightning flashes, I could see the monuments clearly, and for just an instant during each electrical illumination, I could swear that the carved inscriptions on every visible headstone were different from what they had been during daylight hours. The next morning, I reviewed the photographs on my computer. The images were even more disturbing when viewed on a large monitor. The altered inscriptions were clearly defined and positioned on monuments in ways that suggested intelligence rather than random digital glitches. Most terrifying was the final photograph. A wide shot of the entire cemetery section where I had been working. Every visible monument displayed text that was completely different from its actual carved inscription, and all of the altered text was addressing me directly. "Robert, you now carry our true stories." I have never returned to Graceland Cemetery, and I have never attempted storm photography in any cemetery since that Halloween evening. The photographs remain on my hard drive, backed up securely. They are evidence of something that challenges everything I thought I knew about death and photography. Sometimes late at night, when I am reviewing digital images, I can still hear voices calling my name and the sound of stone grinding against stone. Digital photography is supposed to capture reality exactly as it exists. But that night, I learned that some realities exist only in the space between pressing the shutter and viewing the image. The dead are not always content with the stories carved in stone. Sometimes they prefer to rewrite history themselves, one photograph at a time. Let's move to our third story. And the account opens with a genealogy researcher who discovered that some family graves refused to stay buried. Tracing my ancestry seemed harmless enough until I found my great-great-grandmother's grave and realized why no family member had ever visited it. My name is James, and what I uncovered at Hillcrest Cemetery in rural Pennsylvania has forced me to question everything I believed about death, family secrets, and the price of forbidden knowledge. The research began innocently during the winter of 2022, when pandemic restrictions left me with endless time to explore genealogy websites. I had always been curious about my mother's side of the family, particularly the mysterious gaps in our lineage dating back to the 1890s. My grandmother had died when I was 12, taking most family stories with her. My mother consistently avoided questions about her great-grandmother, dismissing my curiosity with uncomfortable comments about her being a difficult woman who had brought shame to the family. After months of searching historical records and cemetery databases, I finally discovered a lead. Constance, my great-great-grandmother, had been born in 1862 in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and had died in 1897 at the unusually young age of 35. The death certificate listed her cause of death as complications from childbirth, which seemed straightforward enough. More intriguing was the discovery that she had been buried in Hillcrest Cemetery in the tiny mountain town of Garrett, Pennsylvania, a place none of my living relatives had ever mentioned visiting. I decided to make the 4-hour drive from my home in Pittsburgh to Pennsylvania's mountains to locate Constance's grave and photograph it for my genealogy records. The trip would give me a chance to explore the region where my ancestors had lived and perhaps discover additional family members buried in the same cemetery. Hillcrest Cemetery occupies a steep hillside overlooking the Castleman River, a small rural burial ground that has served the farming and mining communities of southwestern Pennsylvania since the 1820s. The cemetery contains fewer than 400 graves, most dating from the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the area thrived with coal mining operations. Many headstones are simple sandstone markers bearing only names and dates, reflecting the modest means of the hard-working families who settled the region. I arrived in Garrett on a frigid February afternoon when snow covered the ground and gray clouds threatened additional storms. The cemetery caretaker, an elderly woman named Martha, met me at the entrance gate and offered to help locate Constance's grave. Martha had been maintaining the cemetery for over 20 years and claimed to know the history behind every burial in the grounds. "Constance, you said?" Martha adjusted her wool scarf thoughtfully. "There is a family plot up on the East Ridge, but I must warn you that area has always been problematic. Strange occurrences happen there, especially when relatives come searching for old Constance." I pressed Martha for more details, but she simply shook her head and said I would understand once I saw the grave myself. She provided me with a hand-drawn map showing the family plot's location and wished me luck, though her expression suggested I would need more than luck. The walk to the east section required about 20 minutes along a winding gravel path that climbed steeply through bare oak and maple trees. Snow crunched under my boots with each step, and the air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. As I climbed higher, the well-maintained graves of the main cemetery gave way to older, more weathered monuments that had been neglected for generations. The family plot was located in a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreen trees that blocked most of the afternoon light. The area felt noticeably warmer than the rest of the cemetery despite the snow coverage, and an unusual silence seemed to muffle even the sound of wind through the pine branches. 3 headstones marked the family graves, with Constance's being the most elaborate, despite obvious age and weathering. What immediately struck me as unusual was the condition of Constance's burial site compared to others in the plot. While her husband's and children's graves were covered with undisturbed snow, Constance's burial area was completely bare. The ground around her headstone appeared scorched, as if intense heat had melted the snow and burned the earth beneath. The headstone itself was carved from black slate instead of the gray sandstone used for other family members. The inscription was more detailed than typical for rural Pennsylvania burials of that era. It read, "Constance, 1862 to 1897. She who sought knowledge beyond mortal understanding shall find no peace. May her sins die with her." Below the dates was carved a symbol I did not recognize. a complex geometric pattern that seemed to shift and change when I looked at it directly. I photographed the headstone from multiple angles, noting details I could research later. The symbol particularly intrigued me, though I found no reference to it in any genealogy materials or online searches. As I worked, I became increasingly aware of an uncomfortable sensation, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the surrounding evergreen trees. After completing my photography, I sat on a fallen log near the family plot to review the images and make notes about the unusual inscription. That was when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In several photographs, there appeared to be a figure standing beside Constance's headstone. A woman in a long, dark dress with pale skin and hollow eyes. The figure was clearly visible in the images, but when I looked up to examine the grave directly, nothing was there. I took additional photographs, carefully framing each shot to eliminate shadows or reflections that might explain the mysterious figure. But in every image, the dark-dressed woman was present, sometimes standing behind the headstone, sometimes kneeling beside it, and in one particularly disturbing shot, appearing to emerge from the scorched earth itself. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the temperature around Constance's grave began to rise noticeably. What had been a cold February day became uncomfortably warm near the burial site, with steam beginning to rise from the bare ground. I was preparing to leave when I heard something that changed everything I thought I knew about my family's history. A voice, barely audible but unmistakably feminine, spoke my name from somewhere within the evergreen trees surrounding the family plot. James. The voice was soft and melodious, but carried an accent I could not place. Something old-fashioned and formal that reminded me of recordings from the Victorian era. Most disturbing of all, the voice seemed to know exactly who I was and why I had come to this remote cemetery. James, you have finally come to learn the truth about your heritage. I stood frozen beside the fallen log, scanning the tree line for any sign of who might be speaking. The woods remained empty, but the voice continued, sometimes seeming to come from the trees, sometimes from the direction of Constance's grave itself. Your mother never told you the real story about me, did she? About what I discovered in life, what powers I wielded, what prices I paid for knowledge that ordinary minds could never comprehend. The voice was definitely emanating from the direction of Constance's headstone, though I could see nothing that might explain its source. I approached the grave slowly, my phone recording video to capture evidence of whatever was happening. I was not a simple farm wife like the others in this valley. I was a student of hidden arts, a seeker of forbidden knowledge, a practitioner of rituals that most people fear to acknowledge. I learned to communicate with spirits, to command elements, to reach across barriers that separate this world from realms beyond human understanding. As the voice spoke, the strange symbol carved into Constance's headstone began to emit a faint reddish glow that hurt my eyes to observe directly. The temperature around the grave became even warmer, and I could smell something burning, though I saw no source of fire or smoke. But knowledge demands sacrifice, James. Power requires payment. I gave everything I possessed to learn the secrets of life and death, and in return, death claimed me before my time. The townspeople said I died in childbirth, but that was a lie told to preserve their sanity. The truth is that I opened doorways that should have remained sealed, and what came through those doorways consumed me. The voice grew stronger and clearer, as if whatever was speaking was drawing energy from my presence. I wanted to flee this cursed place and never return, but found myself unable to move, transfixed by the impossible conversation with my long-dead ancestor. I have been bound to this place for over a century, trapped by the very forces I sought to master, waiting for someone from my bloodline to come seeking answers, someone who could help me complete what I started. The symbol on the headstone was now glowing brightly enough to cast shadows, and the scorched earth around the grave began to crack and shift as if something were trying to emerge from below. You possess the gift, James. I can sense it in you. The same hunger for knowledge that drove me to explore forbidden territories. You could learn what I learned, accomplish what I failed to complete. All you need to do is touch the stone and accept the inheritance that has been waiting for you. I realized with horror that I was actually considering the offer, despite every rational instinct screaming at me to run. Part of my mind was genuinely curious about what Constance had discovered, what knowledge she had gained that was worth sacrificing her life to obtain. Touch the stone, James. Accept your birthright. Learn the secrets that your mother was too frightened to embrace. I reached toward the glowing symbol, my hand trembling but moving steadily closer to the black slate surface. The moment my fingers made contact with the carved design, visions flooded my consciousness. I saw Constance in life, tall and gaunt, standing in candlelit chambers surrounded by books and artifacts that radiated malevolent power. I saw her performing rituals involving symbols drawn in blood and incantations spoken in languages that predated human civilization. Most terrifying of all, I saw what she had summoned. Entities from dimensions parallel to our own, beings of pure hunger and malice that existed only to consume and corrupt everything they encountered. Constance had believed she could control these creatures, use their power for her own purposes. Instead, they had used her, driving her to commit acts of violence and depravity that eventually led the townspeople to take justice into their own hands. She had not died in childbirth. She had been executed by frightened neighbors who discovered what she was practicing in the woods behind her property. The visions showed me that Constance's influence had not ended with her death. Her children and descendants had all suffered from various forms of mental illness, addiction, and premature death. My great-grandmother had died in an asylum. My grandmother had struggled with depression her entire life. The family was cursed, marked by choices Constance had made over a century ago. But the visions also revealed something else. A way to break the curse, to sever the connection between my family and the malevolent forces Constance had unleashed. It would require knowledge of the same forbidden arts that had damned her, but used for the opposite purpose. I jerked my hand away from the headstone, breaking the connection and ending the flood of terrible knowledge. The symbol's glow faded immediately, and Constance's voice became distant and confused. No, James, you must complete the ritual. You must accept the power. It is your destiny. But I was already backing away from the grave, my mind reeling from what I had experienced, but my resolve strengthening with each step. I understood now why my mother had never spoken of Constance, why our family had such a history of tragedy and suffering. You cannot escape your heritage, James. The blood remembers. The darkness calls. You will return when you realize there is no other choice. Constance's voice called after me as I hurried down the path toward the cemetery entrance. I drove straight back to Pittsburgh that night. But my research into the family curse was far from over. Sometimes, however, when I pass mirrors in dim light or catch my reflection in darkened windows, I think I can see traces of the knowledge I gained that day. Knowledge that no living person should possess, but which may be necessary to protect those who come after me. Let's move to our fourth story. And the nightmare unfolds with a cemetery equipment technician who discovered that some machinery refuses to work until the dead give their permission. 20 years maintaining cemetery equipment, and I thought I had seen everything until that mist rolled in. My name is Michael, and I've worked as a maintenance supervisor at Willowbrook Cemetery in rural Kentucky since 2004. What happened to me during a routine equipment check on a December evening has convinced me that some places hold memories so powerful they can reach across generations to affect the living. Willowbrook Cemetery sprawls across 75 acres of rolling Kentucky farmland, 15 miles outside Bardstown, serving the scattered Appalachian communities that have called this rugged landscape home for over 2 centuries. The cemetery is divided into several distinct sections. From the ancient pioneer burial grounds dating back to the 1790s to the modern memorial gardens where today's families lay their loved ones to rest. My job involves maintaining the grounds, repairing damaged monuments, and ensuring that our equipment stays in working order despite the harsh Kentucky weather that can destroy machinery faster than anywhere else in the region. The incident occurred on December 18th, 2023, during what should have been a routine evening inspection of our maintenance equipment. We had been experiencing problems with our primary excavator, a massive hydraulic machine that we use for preparing burial sites in the older sections of the cemetery, where the rocky Kentucky soil makes hand digging nearly impossible. The machine had been stalling intermittently for several weeks, and I needed to run diagnostic tests to determine whether we required major repairs or could resolve the issue with simple adjustments. I arrived at the cemetery at approximately 5:30 in the evening, well after sunset during Kentucky's December, when darkness falls by 4:30. The security lighting throughout the cemetery provided adequate illumination for most maintenance work, but the excavator was stored in a shed located in the oldest section of the grounds, where the original pioneer stones marked graves from centuries past. This section had minimal lighting, and I would need to rely on portable work lights to complete the diagnostic procedures. The evening was unusually mild for December, with temperatures hovering around 45 degrees and no wind to speak of. The Kentucky weather had been uncharacteristically calm for several days, which was actually concerning since extended periods of still air often preceded ice storms that could cause extensive damage to the cemetery's older monuments and trees. As I walked toward the maintenance shed, carrying my toolbox and diagnostic equipment, the silence was so complete that I could hear my own footsteps echoing off the weathered limestone headstones that surrounded the narrow gravel path. Willowbrook Cemetery's oldest section contains some of Kentucky's most historically significant burials, including Civil War soldiers, frontier settlers, and Baptist ministers who shaped the religious landscape of central Kentucky during the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of the headstones are carved with intricate folk art designs and inscriptions that few people can read today, due to weathering and archaic language. The section has an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in the cemetery, a sense of weight and history that seems to press down on visitors like the Kentucky fog that frequently shrouds the rolling hills. I reached the maintenance shed and unlocked the heavy metal doors, switching on the interior lighting before backing the excavator out onto the gravel area where I could access its engine compartment and hydraulic systems. The machine was an American-built behemoth, weighing nearly 18 tons, equipped with specialized attachments designed for working in rocky soil and confined spaces between existing graves. Despite its size and power, the excavator had been increasingly unreliable, developing what seemed like a mechanical reluctance to operate in certain areas of the cemetery. The diagnostic procedures required running the engine through various operational cycles while monitoring hydraulic pressure, electrical systems, and computerized controls. The work was methodical and time-consuming, involving detailed measurements and adjustments that demanded my complete attention. I had been working for approximately 90 minutes when I first noticed the mist beginning to form among the ancient headstones surrounding the maintenance area. Kentucky fog is a common phenomenon, particularly during winter evenings, when temperature differences between the warming earth and cooling air create ideal conditions for mist formation. But this fog was different from anything I had experienced during my 20 years working in the cemetery. Instead of the typical gray mist that drifts slowly across the landscape, this fog was almost silver in color and seemed to have a luminescent quality that made it visible even in the dim lighting of the old cemetery section. More unsettling was the way the fog moved. Rather than drifting naturally with air currents, it appeared to flow with purpose and direction, streaming between the headstones like water following predetermined channels. Within minutes, the fog had surrounded my work area completely, reducing visibility to no more than 10 feet in any direction. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air became thick and heavy with moisture that seemed to cling to everything it touched. I continued working on the excavator, assuming the fog would dissipate as quickly as it had formed. Kentucky weather changes rapidly, and I had learned to ignore minor atmospheric disturbances that would send city folks running for shelter. But as I worked, I became increasingly aware that something was fundamentally wrong with the fog surrounding me. It was too thick, too persistent, and too purposeful in its movements to be a natural meteorological phenomenon. The first clear indication that I was experiencing something supernatural came when I heard voices speaking in what sounded like Old English somewhere within the fog. The voices were distant and indistinct, like conversations heard through thick walls. But they were definitely human in origin and seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. I paused in my work and listened carefully, trying to determine the source and number of speakers. The conversations continued for several minutes, sometimes growing louder and clearer, before fading back into whispered exchanges that I could barely detect. I recognized occasional words from the archaic dialect, enough to understand that the speakers were discussing someone or something with apparent urgency. The tone of the conversations suggested concern or perhaps fear, though the old-fashioned language made it difficult to comprehend specific meaning. As I listened to the voices, the fog began to shift and swirl around the ancient headstones, taking on shapes that resembled human figures moving through the mist. At first, I assumed my eyes were playing tricks on me, creating the illusion of forms where none existed. But the shapes became increasingly distinct and numerous until I could see dozens of translucent figures moving among the graves with obvious purpose and direction. The figures appeared to be people from different historical periods, their clothing and appearance reflecting the various eras represented by the burials in this section of the cemetery. Pioneer men in homespun clothing, women in simple frontier dresses, Civil War soldiers in both Union and Confederate uniforms, and children whose small forms seemed to drift through the fog like wisps of smoke. They moved silently, except for the occasional conversations that continued to echo through the mist. What struck me as most significant was that all of the figures seemed to be moving toward my location, converging on the maintenance area where I was working on the excavator. They did not appear threatening or malevolent, but their focused attention on my activities was unmistakably intentional. Some of the figures pointed in my direction while speaking to their companions. Others stood at the edges of my work area, watching my diagnostic procedures with obvious interest. I tried to continue working, telling myself that the fog and figures were hallucinations brought on by fatigue, stress, or perhaps carbon monoxide exposure from the excavator's exhaust. But the voices continued to grow clearer and more distinct, and I began to understand fragments of what the figures were discussing. They were talking about the excavator, about mechanical disturbances in their eternal rest, and about someone who needed to understand the true source of the machine's problems. One voice, clearer than the others and speaking in accented English, addressed me directly. The speaker appeared to be an elderly man in frontier clothing, his form more solid and distinct than the other figures surrounding him. "You cannot repair what is not broken, Michael," the voice said, using my name despite the fact that I had never encountered this figure before. "The machine works as it should in most places, but here in the old ground, it struggles against memories that run deeper than Kentucky limestone." I stopped working completely and faced the speaking figure, no longer able to pretend that I was experiencing hallucinations or environmental effects. The man who addressed me appeared to be a frontier settler from the early 1800s, wearing homespun clothing and carrying himself with obvious authority. His face was weathered by frontier hardships, and his eyes held the intensity of someone who had lived through violent times and difficult decisions. "Your machine disturbs rest that has been centuries in the making," he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the fog despite the fact that he appeared to be standing several meters away. "Each time it breaks the earth in this section, it awakens memories of those who died violently, those who were buried in secret, those whose spirits cannot find peace because their deaths were never properly acknowledged or avenged." Other figures began to speak as well, some in archaic English and others in languages I could not identify, telling me stories about the burials in this section of the cemetery that were not recorded in any official records. They spoke of Civil War deserters executed by their own units and buried in unmarked graves to prevent them from becoming martyrs. They described frontier families who had died during Indian raids, forced from their homesteads and left to perish from violence and exposure. They told of feuds between settlers that had resulted in secret killings, with victims buried quickly and quietly to avoid further bloodshed. "The earth remembers what men choose to forget," the frontier man explained. "Your machine awakens these memories each time it disturbs the soil, and the awakened dead cannot rest until their stories are told and their deaths are properly acknowledged." The excavator's mechanical problems, I realized, were not caused by worn parts or hydraulic failures. The machine was responding to supernatural interference from spirits who could not tolerate having their burial places disturbed by modern technology. "What do you want from me?" I asked the assembled figures, feeling foolish for having a conversation with what might be nothing more than fog-induced hallucinations, but unable to ignore the compelling reality of their presence. "Acknowledgement," the frontier man replied simply. "Recognition that this ground holds more than official records indicate. Respect for those who died without proper ceremony or public recognition. Understanding that some places require more than mechanical solutions to their problems." The fog began to dissipate as suddenly as it had formed, and the translucent figures faded back into the mist until only their voices remained. The frontier man was the last to disappear, his final words echoing across the ancient burial ground as the Kentucky night returned to its normal stillness. "The machine will work properly now, Michael, as long as you remember what you have learned tonight. Some maintenance requires more than tools and diagnostic equipment. Some repairs can only be accomplished through understanding and respect for what came before." I completed my diagnostic procedures in normal lighting conditions, and the excavator performed flawlessly for the remainder of the evening. When I returned to work the following morning, the machine operated without any of the problems that had plagued it for weeks. However, I made one significant change to our maintenance procedures. Before using heavy equipment in the older sections of the cemetery, I now take a few minutes to acknowledge the people buried there, speaking aloud to let them know that their rest will be disturbed only briefly, and only for the purpose of preparing final resting places for others. The excavator has not experienced mechanical problems since that December evening, and I have not encountered the frontier figures again. But sometimes, on still evenings when fog drifts across the Kentucky hills, I can hear distant conversations in archaic English coming from the old section of the cemetery. The voices no longer sound urgent or concerned. Instead, they carry the peaceful tone of people who have finally found the recognition and respect they had been seeking for generations. Let's move to our fifth story, and the horror commences with a dog walker whose loyal companion refused to enter the cemetery section where the dead were trying to communicate. Rusty always loved our evening walks through Oak Hill Cemetery until he started refusing to go near the Pioneer section. My name is Christopher, and I have lived in Salem, Oregon for 8 years, sharing my life with Rusty, a 5-year-old German shepherd who has been my faithful companion since he was 10 weeks old. What happened during our routine evening walk 4 months ago has convinced me that animals possess instincts that allow them to detect dangers completely invisible to human perception. Oak Hill Cemetery sits on 35 acres of gently sloping hills in Salem's historic district, bordered by residential neighborhoods and overlooked by the Cascade Mountains. The cemetery was established in 1882 and contains sections representing different eras of Oregon's development, from the original pioneer burials to modern memorial gardens with contemporary headstones and landscaping. A network of gravel pathways winds through the grounds, making it popular with dog walkers, joggers, and families who appreciate the tranquil atmosphere and mature trees. Rusty and I had been walking through the cemetery almost every evening for over 3 years without incident. Our routine was always consistent. Enter through the main gate around 6:30, follow the perimeter path for approximately 45 minutes, then exit through the east entrance near our house 4 blocks away. Rusty loved these walks, particularly during fall when the oak trees scattered golden leaves across the pathways and the cooler air made his thick coat more comfortable. The cemetery staff had always welcomed responsible dog owners who cleaned up after their pets and respected the solemn nature of the grounds. Rusty was exceptionally well behaved around memorial sites, never barking at other visitors or showing interest in the flowers and decorations left on graves. He seemed to understand that the cemetery required different behavior than our walks through city parks or along the Willamette River. The first sign that something had changed occurred on November 8th, during what should have been an ordinary evening walk. We had completed about half our usual route when we approached the section containing the oldest burials dating back to the 1880s, when Salem was still a frontier town with a small population of farmers, loggers, and merchants. This section features weathered sandstone headstones, elaborate Victorian monuments, and mature maple trees that create deep shadows even during daylight hours. Rusty had always enjoyed this part of our walk, often stopping to investigate interesting scents or to watch squirrels gathering nuts among the fallen leaves. But on November 8th, he stopped abruptly about 75 feet before we reached the Pioneer section, planting his feet firmly on the pathway and refusing to move forward despite my gentle encouragement. At first, I assumed he was distracted by another dog or wildlife that I had not noticed. German shepherds are naturally alert and can become fixated on scents or sounds that humans cannot detect. I looked around carefully, but saw nothing unusual. The cemetery was nearly empty except for a maintenance worker raking leaves in a distant section. and the only sounds were typical evening noises from the surrounding neighborhood. "Come on, Rusty," I said, tugging gently on his leash. "Let's finish our walk." But Rusty would not budge. Instead, he began to growl softly, a low rumbling sound I had rarely heard from him except when he sensed genuine danger. His body language indicated high alert. Ears pricked forward, tail stiff, and muscles tensed as if he were preparing to protect me from an unseen threat. Most unsettling of all, he was staring fixedly at the pioneer section, his attention focused on something I could not see or understand. I followed his gaze, but observed nothing that might explain his agitation. The pioneer section looked exactly as it always did. Weathered headstones arranged in neat rows, mature trees casting long shadows in the evening light, and well-maintained pathways winding between family plots marked by low stone borders. After several minutes of unsuccessful coaxing, I decided to respect Rusty's instincts and alter our route. We backtracked along the pathway and took an alternate route through the newer sections of the cemetery, completing our walk without further incident. Rusty's demeanor returned to normal as soon as we moved away from the pioneer section, and he was his usual alert, relaxed self for the remainder of our evening together. I dismissed the incident as a one-time anomaly, possibly caused by an unfamiliar scent or the presence of wildlife that had moved on before I could identify it. But when we attempted our usual walk the following evening, Rusty exhibited identical behavior. He walked normally until we approached the pioneer section, then stopped abruptly and refused to proceed, displaying the same signs of alertness and protective instinct that had concerned me the night before. This pattern continued for 3 weeks. Rusty would accompany me eagerly on our evening walks, behaving normally throughout most of our route, but would consistently refuse to enter or even approach the pioneer section of the cemetery. His vigilance seemed to intensify with each passing day until he would begin showing signs of alertness as soon as we reached the pathway junction, where we would normally turn toward the older graves. Concerned about Rusty's well-being and curious about what might be causing his unusual behavior, I decided to investigate the pioneer section more thoroughly during daylight hours when Rusty was at home. I visited the cemetery on a Saturday afternoon, walking slowly through the area that had been causing his concern and looking for anything that might explain his protective instincts. The pioneer section during daylight appeared completely normal. The headstones were in good repair, the pathways were clean and well-maintained, and the landscaping was appropriate for a heritage cemetery. I spoke with the groundskeeper, an experienced woman who had worked at Oak Hill Cemetery for over 20 years, asking whether there had been any recent changes or incidents in the pioneer section that might affect animals. "Nothing unusual that I'm aware of," she told me. "Though I have to say, you're not the first person to mention animals acting strangely around the pioneer section recently. We've had several dog walkers comment on similar behavior over the past month or so." This information was both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because it suggested that Rusty's behavior was not unique or necessarily indicative of health problems. Troubling because it implied that something had changed in the pioneer section that was affecting multiple animals in similar ways. The groundskeeper continued, "Animals are sensitive to things we can't perceive. Changes in electromagnetic fields, subsonic vibrations, chemical odors below our threshold of detection. There could be perfectly natural explanations for what your dog is experiencing." But as our conversation continued, she revealed information that suggested less natural possibilities. The pioneer section had been experiencing what she described as unusual activity for several weeks. Visitors had reported feeling uncomfortable in the area. Maintenance equipment had been malfunctioning for no apparent reason, and there had been several complaints about strange sounds heard after dark. "What kind of sounds?" I asked. "Voices," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we were not overheard. "People walking through in the evening have reported hearing conversations, sometimes what sounds like children playing. But when they investigate, there's never anyone there." I thanked her for the information and left the cemetery more concerned than before. That evening, I attempted once again to walk our usual route with Rusty, hoping that my investigation might have somehow resolved whatever was causing his vigilance. But his behavior was unchanged. Eager participation until we approached the pioneer section, then absolute refusal to proceed, accompanied by obvious protective alertness. Frustrated and worried about disrupting Rusty's exercise routine, I made a decision that I would later regret. On November 30th, I brought Rusty to the cemetery earlier in the evening when there was still some daylight, hoping that better visibility might reduce his concern. When he exhibited his usual reluctance to approach the pioneer section, I picked him up and carried him into the area, thinking that direct exposure might help him overcome whatever was affecting his instincts. The moment I stepped into the pioneer section while carrying Rusty, I understood why he had been refusing to enter the area. The temperature dropped noticeably, at least 15 degrees colder than the rest of the cemetery, despite the absence of wind or additional shade. The air felt heavy and oppressive, difficult to breathe, and carried scents that I could not identify, but that made me feel dizzy and nauseated. More disturbing were the sounds that became audible once I was within the boundaries of the pioneer section. Children's laughter echoing from no visible source, footsteps on gravel pathways where no one was walking, and adult voices speaking in what sounded like 19th century dialect that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. Rusty began to tremble violently in my arms, whimpering continuously and struggling to escape my grasp. I set him down, intending to leave immediately, but Rusty bolted. He broke free from his collar and ran toward the cemetery entrance as fast as his legs could carry him, leaving me alone in the pioneer section with whatever was causing the supernatural phenomena. I followed him quickly, but by the time I reached the main pathway, he had disappeared entirely. I spent the next 3 hours searching the neighborhood for Rusty, calling his name and checking all his favorite locations. I contacted the city's animal control services, posted on social media, and asked neighbors to watch for him. Finally, at nearly 10 p.m., I found him huddled on our front porch, still trembling and refusing to eat or drink. Rusty recovered physically from his experience within a few days, but his behavior toward the cemetery changed permanently. He now refuses to walk anywhere near Oak Hill Cemetery, becoming agitated even when we drive past the main entrance. Our evening walks now take us through city parks and along the river, routes that Rusty enjoys, but that lack the peaceful atmosphere we once found among the memorial gardens. I have since learned from other dog owners in the neighborhood that several animals have exhibited similar behavior around the pioneer section of the cemetery. However, what happened 3 weeks later convinced me that Rusty's instincts had saved us from something far worse than I initially realized. I received a call from the cemetery groundskeeper. During routine maintenance, they had discovered a section of ground in the pioneer area that had begun to sink, revealing what appeared to be an unmarked mass grave from the 1880s. Historical records showed that a cholera outbreak had claimed dozens of lives that were hastily buried without proper documentation. The strangest thing, she told me, is that all the animal incidents stopped the day we found the grave. It's like they knew something was down there that needed to be found. The cemetery has since conducted a proper archaeological survey and reburial ceremony for the forgotten victims. The pioneer section is peaceful now. I've tested this by walking past with Rusty, and he shows no signs of distress anymore. The city erected a memorial plaque honoring the cholera victims who had been forgotten for over a century. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when we walk along the river, Rusty will stop and stare in the direction of the cemetery with what I can only describe as a satisfied expression, as if he knows his protective instincts helped those forgotten souls finally find peace. I've learned that animals don't just sense danger. Sometimes they sense when the dead need help from the living. Rusty wasn't protecting me from ghosts. He was alerting me to injustice that demanded attention. His refusal to enter that section led to the discovery of forgotten victims who finally received the recognition and proper burial they deserved. Let's move to our sixth story. And the terror begins with a college fraternity pledge who discovered that some initiation rituals awaken more than school spirit. Senior year traditions are supposed to create lasting memories, not nightmares that haunt you for decades. My name is Anthony, and I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, a city famous for antebellum mansions, Spanish moss, and more ghost stories than anywhere else in the South. What happened during a simple fraternity dare one humid September night at Colonial Park Cemetery didn't just terrify me in the moment. It changed how I view history, the supernatural, and my own responsibility to honor the past. Colonial Park Cemetery is one of the oldest burial grounds in Georgia, established in 1750 and containing the graves of Revolutionary War soldiers, yellow fever victims, and generations of Savannah's earliest families. For locals, the cemetery is both a source of pride and superstition. We respect it during daylight hours with historical tours, school field trips, and occasional family visits when genealogy societies clean the grounds. But after sunset, local legend says you should stay away. At Savannah College of Art and Design, a tradition had developed over the years among the Delta Phi fraternity. The Colonial Challenge. Every fall semester, pledge candidates would be dared to enter the cemetery after midnight, make their way to Colonel Mortimer's tomb, a Revolutionary War officer who died under mysterious circumstances, and leave a fraternity token. It started as harmless fun: pins, coins, or carved letters. Some students would take photos to prove they completed the challenge, then share their experiences at weekend parties. In September 2019, I was a 20-year-old junior, eager to join the fraternity and prove myself worthy of membership. I had been selected by my roommate, Kevin, to fulfill the dare and secure my position within the Brotherhood. The rules were straightforward. Enter the cemetery alone, bring a fraternity medallion, and place it on Colonel Mortimer's monument. With a mixture of nervous anticipation and peer pressure, I agreed. We gathered at Forsyth Park at 11:45 p.m., 8 potential pledges in dark clothing and baseball caps. The September night was thick with humidity, and Spanish moss hung motionless from ancient oak trees like ghostly curtains. Kevin handed me a brass medallion engraved with the fraternity letters. "Just put this on the colonel's tomb and get back quickly," he said, grinning nervously. The wrought iron gates surrounding Colonial Park Cemetery were tall, but climbable for someone determined enough to squeeze through the ornate metalwork. I remember the heavy air hitting my chest as I dropped inside, careful not to catch my clothing on the sharp decorative points. My fraternity brothers watched from across Abercorn Street, whispering and checking their phones as I switched on a small LED flashlight. Navigating the cemetery at night feels otherworldly. The air seemed denser with the scent of magnolia blossoms and rich earth. My flashlight beam revealed weathered marble headstones and elaborate Victorian monuments, many so eroded by centuries of coastal weather that inscriptions had become illegible. Ancient live oak trees grew in twisted shapes, their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed despite the absence of any breeze. Colonel Mortimer's tomb sits near the cemetery's eastern wall, an imposing granite structure with his name, military rank, and death date of 1779. Local stories claim he was never properly honored for his Revolutionary War service, and his restless spirit sometimes appears to those who disturb his grave. Some say he died not in battle, but from a duel over a woman's honor, which explains why his spirit cannot find peace. When I reached the tomb, my heart was racing from both exertion and anxiety. I placed the brass medallion on the cold granite surface and whispered almost automatically, "Thank you for your service, Colonel." The humidity seemed to intensify, and Spanish moss rustled overhead despite the complete absence of wind. As I turned to leave, something extraordinary happened. My LED flashlight flickered several times, then dimmed to a strange amber glow. I thought the battery was failing, but when I tapped it, the beam returned to normal brightness, except now it seemed to reveal things that hadn't been there moments before. The air felt significantly cooler than the surrounding September heat, and I heard voices, not the distant chatter of my fraternity brothers, but low murmuring, as if several people were having quiet conversations just beyond my hearing. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the sounds. A figure emerged from behind Colonel Mortimer's monument. A young man about my age, dressed in colonial-era clothing. His face was pale as moonlight, with sorrowful eyes and a mouth set in grim disapproval. I froze, unable to speak or move. He pointed to the medallion on the tomb, then looked directly at me. "You should not honor him with trinkets," he said quietly. His voice carried strangely in the humid air, seeming to echo from multiple directions. "He deserves no gifts from the living, only justice for what he did to us." I managed to stammer. "Who are you? What happened here?" He shook his head sadly. "Names matter little now. What matters is truth." I felt the ground beneath my feet grow soft and warm, as if the earth itself was responding to his presence. Looking around the cemetery, I realized other figures were materializing from behind headstones and monuments. Men and women in Revolutionary War-era clothing, their faces expressing anger, sorrow, and desperate longing. Colonel Mortimer was no hero, the young man continued. He used his military position to steal from families, to force himself on women, to execute soldiers who challenged his authority. We died because of his cruelty, and our stories were buried with us, while his monument celebrates lies. A cold wind suddenly swept through the cemetery, stirring Spanish moss and scattered leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the entrance, scrambling over twisted roots and uneven ground, my breathing coming in panicked gasps. As I climbed through the wrought iron gates, I heard a deep, angry roar echoing from somewhere near the colonel's tomb. I rejoined my fraternity brothers, who were startled by my wild-eyed appearance and barely coherent explanation. Kevin listened carefully, his expression growing serious as I finished my account. "You saw someone in the cemetery?" he asked. "A guy in old clothes?" I nodded, still shaking. He said the colonel wasn't a hero, that people died because of him. Several of my fraternity brothers laughed nervously and tried to dismiss my story as imagination and adrenaline. But Kevin wasn't convinced. My grandfather told me stories about that cemetery. He said some of the Revolutionary War graves hold people who died from more than British bullets. That statement haunted me for weeks. I found myself drawn to the Georgia Historical Society archives, searching for more information about Colonel Mortimer and the people buried in Colonial Park Cemetery during the Revolutionary War period. What I discovered confirmed my worst fears. Most disturbing was a collection of letters from 1779 describing Colonel Mortimer's court-martial for theft, assault, and the execution of 3 soldiers who had tried to report his crimes to superior officers. The trial was interrupted by his sudden death, officially attributed to yellow fever, but privately rumored to be suicide or murder by the families of his victims. His military monument had been erected decades later by distant relatives who knew nothing of his actual conduct. I began to understand how we treat sites of historical trauma and injustice. The Colonial Challenge was supposed to be harmless fun, a way for college students to prove their courage and bond with fraternity brothers. But what if these traditions actually strengthened connections to dark histories rather than healing them? What if leaving tokens at Colonel Mortimer's tomb only perpetuated the lies carved into his monument? As the next fall semester approached, I was elected fraternity president, and the Colonial Challenge tradition came up for discussion among new pledges. This time, I advocated for a complete change in approach. Instead of leaving offerings for Colonel Mortimer, we would honor the victims of his crimes by researching their stories and sharing them with the college community. Learn about the people who suffered. Visit their graves during daylight hours and acknowledge their pain. Study what happened and why it must never be repeated. The tradition evolved that year. Some fraternity members resisted, others embraced the change. Kevin and I returned to Colonial Park Cemetery during the day, placing wildflowers at the graves of Revolutionary War soldiers who had died far from home and reading their names aloud. I never encountered the colonial spirits again. But every time I walk past Colonial Park Cemetery, I sense a presence. Less angry now, more grateful. 5 years later, that September night still influences my decisions. I've remained in Savannah as a historical researcher and community educator, working to teach people about our complex past in ways that honor both survivors and victims. Occasionally, college students still dare each other to enter the cemetery after dark. But increasingly, those who venture inside do so with humility and respect, seeking to remember rather than to entertain themselves with ghost stories. They come to learn about the real people buried there, not to celebrate false heroes or perpetuate harmful myths. The nightmares have faded, though I sometimes dream of the young man in colonial clothing, his sorrowful eyes now peaceful. His message resonates with me still. Courage means more than accepting dares. It means caring enough to seek truth and learning from history's darkness what must never be repeated. College traditions may seem harmless in the moment, but their consequences echo through generations. In Savannah, the dead remind us that respect requires more than tokens left on monuments. It demands that we tell their true stories and honor their memory through our actions, not our entertainment. Let's move to our 7th story. And the incident starts with a night watchman who discovered that some cemetery residents never stopped attending their evening social gatherings. 4 months into my security job at Bonaventure Cemetery, I learned why they offered triple pay for the graveyard shift. My name is Timothy, and I have worked security at various locations across Savannah for over 12 years. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered patrolling one of Georgia's most famous antebellum burial grounds during the hours between midnight and dawn. Bonaventure Cemetery sprawls across 160 acres of Spanish moss-draped beauty overlooking the Wilmington River, established in the 1840s on the grounds of a former plantation. The cemetery is renowned for its elaborate Victorian monuments, ancient live oak trees, and the haunting statue that inspired the cover of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. My job required patrolling the entire grounds throughout the night, ensuring that vandals, college students, and ghost hunters did not damage the historic monuments or disturb the peace of the dead. When I accepted the position in June 2023, the cemetery's director, Mrs. Catherine Ashford, was unusually detailed in explaining the responsibilities and challenges of night security work. She emphasized that Bonaventure attracts more than its share of problematic visitors after dark. From tourists seeking supernatural experiences to practitioners of various mystical traditions who believe the cemetery's reputation for paranormal activity makes it an ideal location for their ceremonies. The cemetery has a particular atmosphere at night, she explained during my initial interview. Some guards find it overwhelming. We offer premium compensation because we need someone dependable who will not abandon their duties when circumstances become unconventional. I assumed she was referring to the typical challenges of security work in atmospheric locations. Overactive imagination, natural sounds misinterpreted as something ominous, and the tendency to let Gothic surroundings affect professional judgment. I had worked night security at historic buildings, abandoned factories, and waterfront warehouses throughout Savannah. I considered myself immune to supernatural nonsense and confident in my ability to distinguish between genuine security concerns and psychological suggestion. The first 3 months of the job were relatively routine. I performed regular patrols through the cemetery's winding roads, checking locks on gates and mausoleums, monitoring the perimeter fencing, and occasionally confronting college students who had climbed over the walls seeking adventure among the antebellum graves. The work was peaceful, even contemplative, and I began to appreciate the unique beauty of the cemetery at night. When moonlight filtered through Spanish moss and cast intricate shadows across the elaborate monuments, Bonaventure Cemetery is particularly striking during night patrols. The antebellum architects and stonemasons who created the elaborate tombs and monuments intended them to inspire reverence and contemplation of eternity. At night, their neoclassical and Gothic revival designs take on an ethereal quality that can be both beautiful and unsettling, depending on your perspective and state of mind. The section containing the most elaborate family plots becomes especially dramatic when illuminated only by security lighting and the silver glow of Georgia moonlight. The incidents began during my 4th month on the job, starting with subtle anomalies that I initially dismissed as equipment malfunctions or environmental factors. Motion sensors would activate in sections of the cemetery where I had just completed patrols, indicating movement where none should exist. Security cameras occasionally captured brief, unexplained figures moving past monitoring points, though review of the footage never revealed clear images of intruders or wildlife. More concerning were the sounds that began occurring with increasing frequency during my midnight rounds. The rustle of formal clothing on gravel pathways that stopped whenever I investigated, and conversations in refined Southern accents that ceased when I approached their apparent source. Most unsettling were the instances when I could hear someone walking parallel to my own patrol route, matching my pace and direction, but remaining just out of sight among the monuments and ancient oaks. The first major incident occurred on a humid night in early September. I was conducting my regular patrol of the cemetery's oldest section, following the winding roads through the most elaborate antebellum monuments, when I encountered something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of death and the possibility of life beyond the grave. The humidity that night was unusually oppressive, even for coastal Georgia in September. creating a thick atmosphere that seemed to muffle sound and reduce visibility despite my high-powered flashlight. Southern humidity can be dense and disorienting, but this particular air seemed to have an almost tangible quality, as if it were composed of something more substantial than water vapor. It clung to the monuments and Spanish moss with unnatural persistence, creating an atmosphere of isolation and otherworldliness that made even familiar pathways seem alien and mysterious. I was approaching the Mercer family plot, one of the cemetery's most photographed locations, when I heard string quartet music drifting through the humid air. The melody was classical, something that might have been popular during the antebellum period, played with skill and emotion that suggested professional musicians. The music was definitely coming from somewhere within the cemetery, though I knew there were no performance spaces or structures that remained accessible after hours. Following the sound, I made my way deeper into the oldest section, toward what appeared to be the source of the music. The melody grew clearer and more distinct as I approached a section containing some of the cemetery's most elaborate family monuments. Massive marble structures built to house the remains of wealthy plantation families. The music seemed to be emanating from the area around the Whitmore family monument, a neoclassical structure complete with marble columns and intricate carved details. The Whitmore plot had been established in the 1850s, its elaborate monuments sealed for over a century and accessible only to cemetery staff for maintenance purposes. There was no way anyone could be performing music in that location. Yet the string quartet continued to play, with beautiful, melancholy intensity. I approached the monument cautiously, checking the surrounding area for any signs of entry or disturbance. The marble structures were secure and showed no evidence of recent interference. The monuments were intact and firmly set in their foundations. But the chamber music continued, now accompanied by what sounded like polite applause and the quiet conversations typical of a refined musical salon. I could hear chairs being moved, programs rustling, and the cultured conversations of what seemed to be a well-educated audience discussing the musical selections with obvious knowledge and appreciation. I used my radio to contact the cemetery's emergency response service, reporting possible trespassers in the Whitmore family section. Within 45 minutes, Mrs. Ashford arrived with groundskeeping staff and permission to investigate the area thoroughly. What we discovered when we examined the monument area changed my understanding of what security work at Bonaventure Cemetery actually entailed. The monument area was empty, except for the marble memorials containing the remains of the Whitmore family members and the moss and debris that accumulate in historic cemeteries over many decades. There were no musicians, no chairs for an audience, and no evidence that anyone had been in the area for weeks. But as we stood among the monuments with our flashlights illuminating the marble surfaces, the string quartet music continued, now seeming to come from the Spanish moss itself, or perhaps from somewhere beneath the ancient live oak trees. This is what I meant when I said circumstances can become unconventional, Mrs. Ashford said quietly, her calm demeanor suggesting that she had encountered similar phenomena before. Bonaventure has a long history of residents who continue to appreciate the finer things that made their earthly lives meaningful. She explained that several of the antebellum burials in the oldest section had been notable musicians, artists, and cultural patrons who had achieved considerable influence during their lifetimes. Some of these individuals appeared to have difficulty accepting the limitations that death placed on their ability to continue enjoying the cultural activities that had defined their social status, leading to periodic supernatural gatherings that could be heard but not directly observed. The Whitmore family were great patrons of the arts, she continued, as we completed our investigation and prepared to continue the patrol. They frequently hosted musical evenings and literary salons in their plantation home. It appears that some of these cultural traditions have continued in their final resting place. The string quartet music faded as we moved away from the monument area, but I could hear faint applause and refined conversation continuing among the marble memorials. Mrs. Ashford assured me that these phenomena were harmless, merely the continuation of activities that had been important to the deceased during their lifetimes. Over the following weeks, I encountered numerous other instances of supernatural activity during my patrols. Visitors from different historical periods appeared briefly in my peripheral vision before vanishing when I turned to look directly at them. Conversations in various southern dialects echoed through the cemetery, sometimes in accents and speech patterns that seemed to belong to centuries past. Most remarkably, I began to recognize patterns in the phenomena, as if the various spirits maintained schedules and routines that mirrored their behavior in life. The Confederate gentleman who appeared regularly near the military section always wore formal dress uniform and carried himself with obvious pride in his service. The woman in mourning dress who walked among the family plots always carried fresh magnolia blossoms and moved with the purposeful stride of someone completing important memorial duties. The children who played games among the angel statues were always dressed in clothing from the 1920s and seemed to be perpetually engaged in the same elaborate game of hide-and-seek that well-bred Southern children might have played during their earthly lives. I learned to work around these supernatural residents rather than trying to avoid or confront them. They showed no interest in interfering with my security duties, and I gradually came to view them as part of the cemetery's nighttime community rather than intruders or threats. My job was to protect Bonaventure Cemetery from vandalism and disturbance. These long-term residents seemed to share that objective, maintaining their own form of respectful guardianship over the grounds they had chosen as their eternal home. The most profound lesson I learned during my time as a night security guard at Bonaventure Cemetery was that death does not necessarily end all human appreciation for beauty, culture, and social connection. The antebellum South's elaborate approach to death and mourning, combined with the artistic and cultural achievements of many buried in the cemetery, seems to have created conditions where some aspects of refined living persist beyond physical death. I completed my contract at Bonaventure Cemetery after 2 years, having grown comfortable with the unique challenges of protecting a location where the living and the dead share the same appreciation for beauty and tradition. The experience taught me that security work in historically significant places requires more than technical skills and physical courage. It demands respect for the past, sensitivity to the unseen, and the wisdom to understand that some cultural traditions refuse to be buried. Mrs. Ashford was right about the premium compensation being necessary, not because the work was frightening, but because it required someone capable of understanding that security at Bonaventure Cemetery meant protecting not just monuments and landscaping, but the ongoing cultural life of those who had chosen this beautiful place as their eternal gathering space. Thank you for joining us on Silent Fears. If these stories gave you chills, smash that like button and subscribe for more supernatural tales. The dead may be silent, but their stories live on. Let us know your thoughts below.